Once in a dark and gloomy forest, a pack of wolves surrounded a lone warrior. Their leader was a furious beast of enormous size and intelligence. Stepping forward amidst the aggressive growls of the other pack members, she had addressed the brave warrior, asking him how we intended to fight them without sharp fangs or powerful claws. However, in just a moment, the lone warrior no longer appeared, as weak and defenseless as she did before amongst the encircling wolves who were growling men menacingly. There was another creature it stood on all fours, leaning its head toward the ground, cropping itself up with two powerful paws. Its skin, covered in spikes resembling scales, was jet black. In the next moment, the creature rose onto its hind legs, standing at full height. This creature turned out to be a humanoid lizard with a menacing, toothy smile and eyes that shone with bright red light. It also possessed a powerful physique that struck fear into anyone who looked at it. However, even after witnessing this, the pack leader was not inclined to retreat and let out a fierce howl. Following their leader's command, the wolves viciously attacked. But despite their numerical advantage, they still had no chance. The humanoid lizard effortlessly dispatched them one by one, using its clawed paw to swiftly each wolf's life. This was because the lizard-like creature's primary weapon was not its teeth and claws, but sweetened blood, flesh, and bone. Stepping on the next wolf with its clawed paw, it instantaneously took the creature's life at the same time. The pack leader, with rage in its eyes, watched as its kin were mercilessly destroyed by the once feeble warrior. Unable to bear it any longer, it let out a furious roar, then opened its massive jaws with sharp fangs and lunged at the lizard-like monster. But victory was not in the cards, for the next moment, the humanoid lizard intercepted the pack leader attack, grabbing it by the jaw with its strong, clawed paw. Addressing the furious creature, the lizard said that it consumed the bodies of its enemies and used them as its weapons. After sinking its sharp teeth into the wolf pack leader's throat, it declared with a bloodthirsty voice that it would kill him, and by devouring him, it would become even stronger in this woe. Areld of magical beings with unique abilities, they were referred to as mystical creatures. A small number of people were also granted the ability to transform into mystical creatures. They served as prophets who worked for the betterment of humanity. But as always, where there was good, there was also evil in this world. There existed embodiments of this divine power, which people referred to with trepidation as the demonic god in the midst of a dark forest. The man was running. His silhouette was shrouded in darkness, while his breathing was erratic and heavy, rushing with all his might in his exhausted legs. The young man, with tears in his eyes and a desperate voice, was no longer able to scream. His vision was blurred, and he moved only by fear and survival instincts. The reason he was fleeing was an arrow loaded into a crossbow and aimed directly at his back. And next moment, the sound of the released bow string resounded, followed immediately by the painful cry of the fleeing man, who was struck in the back by the arrow. Right after that, a joyful male voice could be heard, laughing and celebrating the accuracy of his shot. The owner of the voice was a bald, middle-aged man, dressed in light armor, holding a crossbow in his hands. Another man with long hair praised him for the shot. The sharpshooter proudly responded with a smirk that it was quite easy. The attackers were dripped with blood. After murder's foreman lay in their own blood without signs of life. Their attempt to defend themselves had been unsuccessful, as there were more enemies, and thus their foes celebrated victory, while those who had lost forever froze on the cold forest ground. Before sunset, they needed to take anything of value, no matter how small. The bandits quickly searched the bodies and claimed their reward. It's just a feeling, but a day the force feels particularly eerie, said one of the crimina. Lel Sand. With these words, the group of criminals began their journey. A group of 9 criminals walked through an natural alley of majestic trees, which, when darkness fell upon the forest, took on eerie shapes. The group was in good spirits due to their easy pickings. A sarcastic voice came from the crowd. What monster could be in this forest, and why would it be watching us right now? The crowd laughed in response. Waits, shouted the group's leader, who was walking ahead. Everyone froze. The closest killer's face was covered in sweat, and even his thick beard and the hair hanging over his forehead couldn't hide his fear. He wasn't alone in this feeling. Another criminal standing nearby shared his unease. It was evident, even from beneath the black hood. He wore one of the bandits who stood at the center of the group and couldn't see anything, couldn't hold back, and asked, "What's there?" "Animal carcasses." The bandit replied heavily. His gaze revealed a horrifying sight. The trees were marked with claw marks from some creature, and some of them were torn in half and scattered on the ground. On one of the fallen trees hung the lifeless body of a dead wolf mew. Tilated animal bodies were strewn all over, even in semi-darkness. Their gray bodies were clearly visible. Their eyes had lost their gleam, and bloody puddles flowed from their mouths. Martin the bandit, with slick back hair and a 3-day stubble, knelt down to examine the nearest body. Enormous chunks of flesh had been torn from the gray creature's body, exposing its bones. The bearded man approached his comrade and asked if this might have been a territorial battle, as one pack might have clashed with another leading to a fight. The answer from the criminal disturbed everyone. I'm not sure, but it looks like they were cut down unilaterally. It's something powerful. The bandit examining the bodies nearby suddenly exclaimed that the leader should take a look. Martin and two of his closest comrades got up and headed the man was pointing. This is the corpse of a mythical creature, one of the bandits said, the carcass of a massive black wolf with deep gashes on its hide. Some areas of the skin had been ripped off along with the flesh. The beast hadn't gone down without a fight. Bloody traces were everywhere. But the men were not captivated by the dead beast. Instead, they were fixated on the young man, leaning against the wolf's carcass. It seemed as thought the young man was dead. He had short, black hair, a muscular torso, and a commanding presence. The youth attire was somewhat peculiar, with a broad belt, featuring an emblem resembling a dragon's head. His upper body was bare and his arms, starting from the shoulders, were jet black. He wore armored gauntlets on his wrists. His pants and boots were unremarkable, sorting their thoughts. The bandit with the hood and his men approached closer. The man immediately noticed that the body behind them was the leader of the pack. What could this scoundrel be doing here? Martina skid, looking at the bowed head of the youth. As they gazed at the carcass of the once fearsome beast whose fangs appeared, ready to tear people to shreds, the bandit wondered if this young man could have killed the magical creature before he could finish voicing his thought. Martin replied, telling him not to speak nonsense. Noon care show this vagrant gather. Martin approached the guy even closer and stretched out his hand, saying that he needed to see if he had anything useful. Before the bandit could realize his plan, a sharp pain shot through his leg and he couldn't hold back his scream. What is wrong with this stupid lizard? Their lizard, the size of a dog, clawed at the bandit's leg from the bandits, howled, trying to shake the attacker off his leg with a smile on his face. The bandit who had shot the young man with a crossbow some time ago approached Martin, but now he was holding a different weapon, a hunting knife. Don't move. Martin has said, I will cut him in two-headed. Then he swung and struck. Suddenly the man felt a terrible pain in his arm, looking the place of the greatest pain. He saw only a blood fountain where his arm should have been. His punch at the lizard nev reached the target. Instead, his arm was cut off by a one-handed battle axe. A scream of pain spread through the forest. The bandits' comrades prepared to fight when they saw their comrade's hand cut off by a stranger they thought was dead before the one-armed man could say a word. The fist of the stranger, who had just gotten to his feet and was ready to fight, flew into his face. The bandit's face was deformed by the force of the blow. Blood seemed to be pouring out of his mouth. "Ah, not touch him without my permission." The stranger said with an almost demonic expression, "Or I will kill you," teeth clenched in anger and a look full of hatred. That's what you can see on a monster's face. The lizard ran up to the boy and hid behind him, its split and guess sticking out from time to time, giving the impression that it was mocking its opponents. As its defender prepared for the battle, he was not in the best shape after the fight with the magical beast, his body covered with cut shirt and his steps were heavy. The guy clutched the battle axe he was holding in his right hand and prepared to fight this bastard. Starting a fight, one of the criminals shouted, seeing the fate of their comrade. The bandits pulled out their weapons and began to approach the guy the crowd heard a shout from. The bearded man, it was Shu who killed Hans. Their opponent was not silent, but this Hans seems to be still alive. The young man's answer enraged the crowd. Martin shouted out in anger, "You bastardy, you think you can get away with this?" And then the bandit raised his sword in front of him, preparing to attack. The order was given to surround the guy. At the same moment, 3 bandits stood in front of the guy and pointed their weapons at him. "Fools," the young man said, pulling another axe from behind his back. "Do you have someone who will mourn for you? If so, retreat before it's too late." The young man prepared to fight this as focused on his enemies, as if he was about to rush at them. Those who saw the boy's head, that art aura covered his body, giving him a menacing look. The crimson lizard beat its teeth, showing that it was also ready to fight. "Kill him," someone from the crowd shouted, and the 3 closest criminals rushed forward. The guy clutched the handle tightly in his hands. The 2 paired axes he was wielding were formidable weapons, a blade on one side and a sharp spike on the other, black steel with simple patterns engraved on it, and a wooden handle, the perfect weapon for him. Mace Khan later rushed forward. His eyes, his movements did not resemble human, on with remarkable agility. Her ushed through the crowd of enemies, cutting off their limbs. My leg on of the attackers shouted for enemies, fell to the ground, screaming in pain as they tried to stop the bleeding that remained in place of their limbs. All this time, the lizard was attached to the guy's back. In order not to fly off the guy, it had to cling to the warrior's shoulder with its teeth and claws. The bearded man noticed that he was a monster, looking at the agility instra. Engthoff, the young man, seeing his comrades leaning in their blood, seeing limbs that were separated from their owners. The bearded man trembled bastard, Martin said, standing behind the young man while the boy was dealing with the bandits. Martin and two other criminals managed to get behind the hero, raising their crossbows. The bandits ordered the boy to stay still, then the other one and his men fired. The sound of the arrows fired spread around. The boy froze for a moment. He did not expect it to come to this. Without time to dodge, all he could do was grab the lizard hanging on his back and cover it with his body. Grabbing his lizard, the guy pressed it to his body in less than a second. 3 crossbow bolts stuck into his back. A sharp pain penetrated his body, causing him indescribable suffering. The young man clenched his teeth to keep from screaming in pain. "Did we kill him?" asked the crossbow man with a scare in his eyebrow as smile appeared on the bandit's face. Martin did not share his joy and ordered him to wait. Before he could finish speaking, a stream of flame-like energy gushed from the young man's body. This flame was black and red in color, twisting and swirling. As it rose upward, this continued until the shapeless tongues began to take on animal forms. The heads of several animal-like creatures began to emerge from the black flames. In this chaos of shapes and colors, Sonny could recognize the head of a lynx, a wolf, a lizard, and several other unknown animals. And the center of all this horror was a young man who was now screaming in pain. On his back, from his shoulders, black lines began to spread like the roots of a tree that had spread out in different directions. It seemed that blackness had penetrated the boy's veins and spread throughout his body. The toothy faces began to merge into one shape with a roar, darkness, and eye. Enchau's flame and madness mixed to form a head that was bigger and more terrifying than all the others. A black dragon. The dragon's huge mouth was gaping as if it wanted to swallow the moon. The bandits watching this horror could not move. Fear paralyzed their bodies and souls. And then the bearded man said that it was a demon god. The guy almost lost himself. There was nothing human in his eyes, only the flames of hatred and anger. The bandit's words brought the young man back to reality. His eyes became clear. The moment he gained control, the tongues of flame that swirled over him dissipated, just like a bubble that bursts and leaves nothing behind. The crimson spectacle was over, and the forest returned to its darkened imprint. The young man fell to his knees, and the scaly friend did not leave his side, trying to help him. Somehow the young man's body was smoking, as if he had just been roasted on a fire. And this was not far from the truth when he tried to get to his feet. They saw something strange in the trees, but it was not strong enough and lost consciousness. The night's darkness showed no signs of relenting to provide some illumination to the settlement. The villagers lit braziers on the main street. A few houses shed lights flickering in their windows. However, the interiors were empty, as everyone had gathered in the square to inspect their incredible trophy. This small village was well protected, with a high, nearly 3-man wall lined with sharpened stakes. It had 2 pairs of massive wooden gates and 2 towers by the gates manned with armed guards. The architecture of this place bore some resemblance to Scandinavian settlements. "I can't believe it," said the village leader, looking at the dead magical beast that had been brought there on a cart. The man with light hair, around 40 years old, examined the wolf once more. His eyes held surprise, even though he had seen a lot in his lifetime, as evidenced by the claw marks on his face left by the monster. "Did you really do all of this?" the man asked, turning his gaze towards the young man, who was chained and tied to a wooden beam. His small companion had been pushed into a cage from which he was desperately trying to escape by gnawing on the bars. The young man replied confidently, as if he wound by chains. "It would be better if you burned it all," he said, pointing at the dead magical beast. "Tearing you to death would not have been enough," Martin shouted in anger. He was about to start making good on his threat, but the elder's hand stopped him. The elder approached the boy and asked him his name. Ananta. The boy answered, "Why did you do that?" The old man continued to ask. And cancer surprised the elder. "I was hungry." Martin intervened in a conversation, saying that one should not listen to this monster. Everyone had seen him turn into a beast. They mentioned their centromores about the monster eating corpses. Martin continued to insist that a nun was not human, and he showed the scars of a wolf as proof, drawing attention to the places where the flesh had been eaten. He insisted that the boy was a demon in human form. Nun began to laugh, and his mood improved greatly. When Martina asked him why he was laughing, he replied, he said that if Nun was really who he was taken for, then these weak chain would not hold him. His words once again swelled horror in those around him. A bird flew overhead in the cloudless sky. "You know nothing, including what the monster eats." It said splashes of blood poured over the DST. Elder she'd not understand how it happened. The mystical beast that had just been dead had torn the cords that tied him to. Carton had first of all eaten the nearest soldier, and noticed that this creature's existence was reduced to being the hands and feet of a demon godmean, while an endless stream of half-rotten wolves poured into the main gate. Their army was led by a mystical beast, who pointed to the gate with his hand raised. His army completely obeyed him, and despite the crossbow fire from the village guards, The wolves climbed and jumped on the walls, a tower of animals formed at the foot of the gate. The animals climbed on top of each other, creating steps of bodies, the solgi. Rice, defending the gate from the inside, could not resist the enemy. Although the wolves climbed over several individuals, there was no chance of escape for men unprepared for such a thing. The animals tore people to pieces, they bit off their heads and ate at their insides. Martin was attacked by two wolves, and while one was butting into his arm, the other one, which had no flesh on the part of his skull, bit the man's neck. In all the chaos, Noon noticed that one of the braziers fell on the fence and started affizingly. This fire could have saved people's lives. The fence burned. Edmorian more, and with it the dead animals that continue to climb over. 'Tis Wendell watched his army burn. He noticed Dan object fly through the fence and fall at his feet. It was these veered head of a mystical beast, a black wolf. Thirst and hunger come together to break free blood and sweat, flesh and bone. I am fully prepared to eat. These were the words of the dark lizard addressed to the monster that led the pack. Anyun in the form of a beast approached the fence and broke it like a matchbox house. The fence cracked and shattered under the onslaught of fire that left it. Hence the fence mission failed, and the village was left without its protectional Izard. Black ash was making its way through the wall. Its body exuded heat, while its soul burned with anger. I will disfigure you, I will destroy you. I will make you look like a prey on the verge of death. The foot and mouth diseases ed to its opponent, another magical creature, at all almost tomb humanoids, Tude, opposite his face, looked like a half-rotten cattle skull. In place of the nose, there was only Adpavoid's small white socket speared intently at the enemy, and longhorns grew from the top of the skull. All thought they looked more like tree branches with one main stem, in several units. Gray fur covered the beast's elongated body with black and thicker fur on its chest and arms, and something similar to tree roots growing on its back. The beast's arms were extremely long, and even when it stood on its feet, the fingers of its hands dragged along the ground. The black foot and mouth disease got to its feet. Its appearance inspired respect and admiration. Massive build, muscularity, and power, no vulnerable spots. Its entire body covered with hard scales, and its mouth lined with sharp teeth. Its eyes were blazing red, and it was anticipating a massacre. Geikel beast let out piercing scream. This cry was not a warning, and it was an order. Beasts under the control of the Wendo began to appear from the dark forest. This army of magically controlled beasts consisted of wolves, Sagoa, a deer, and a wild boar to Tolo Baliance. With a shout, the slaves rushed at the lizard, the glint in their eye, saying that they no longer knew fear or anything else, only obedience to their master. The boar and goat were the first to reach the enemy and tried to attack with horns and tusks, and nothing happened. They could not cause any wounds. Sword Discum fought to the lizard with its powerful arms. The black serpent caught their heads, which looked like fragile flowers, in its huge hands, and slammed them to the ground after breaking everything that was fashionable. Their faces were no longer recognizable, and they turned into a mess of flesh and bones. After ending their lives, she began to step forward with his swift strokes, and undivided his opponents into two, until only their leader remained. The enemies meet each other's eyes. As if the dark serpent had seen the very essence of the Wend, the latter wriggled furiously. This the signal, and both monsters rushed forward. Claws bar to attack. Their clash shook the ground, and the opponents struck each other an endless number of times. Drops of blood flew in every direction, but they didn't seem to notice the blows that could have brought down trees. So the wounds that bled, the black lizard roared. The Wendo's swift kick hit it right in the face. Victory was near, the Wendigo thought, until he realized that its claws were clinging to his wrist. It was not impossible to retreat, and the grip was dead in a split second. When the Wendo hesitated, the lizard struck the beast. He had with its hand. The blow was so strong that the skull could not withstand it and cracked, and the body flew several meters in front, leaving the animal's arm in the lizard's clutches like a trophy. The lizard's body began to fly off and unasif in flames until he looked like a man. Slowly, the boy approached the mutilated body of his enemy. The beast began to decompose, and a black liquid flowed from the body of the beast, exposing the ribs. Then the body of a white-haired girl appeared from the monster's carcass, like a caterpillar cocoon. Having finally torn her out of the flesh that covered her, the boy grabbed the girl by the neck and lifted her off the ground, straining. Gizrist, she began to slowly strangle her. The gleam in her blue eyes almost faded. Looking at their blue skin, the young man thought that perhaps she had been unconscious all this time. While they were struggling, a strong wind suddenly picked up, and the boy concentrated on finding the cause of his uneasiness. Instinct told him that someone was watching him, but a whistle from the attack cut the silence, and the young man was unable to react to the enemy and was injured. Blood gushed from his right shoulder. The cut was not deep, but noticeable. Turning around the Gaif, in all he noticed the enemy, an abnormally large vulture, was maneuvering in the air, all the greatness of which can be seen only when it spreads its powerful wings. the vulture descended to the ground and said, "You are god demon who devoured corpses. I have been watching you since you stepped on this earth." As she said these words, the vulture's feathers began to fall off until a middle-aged man appeared underneath. He had heterochromia, and his eyes were different color. His cloak resembled bird wings. His clothes were covered with bird skulls and other similar sim. Olsand, his collar was made of down. Before he could finish speaking, the body of the girl Ananta had dumped flew into his arms. The guy almost fell asleep, while the old man was muttering to himself. At least, that's what On said. The young man was not interested in this conversation. The only thing he wanted was to kill his opponent. The old man began his animal transformation, this time growing arms for combat at the same time. He boasted that his power allowed him to control spirits, and if he killed the lizard, he would get a much better one, better than some deer or wolf. It was no longer just tangent bird. This creature had arms, legs, and wings. Raising its wings, the beast said one word. Phantom and aura appeared around the bird, and it began to spread throughout the territory from contact with it. Every dead person, whether it was animals that had already died twice or people who had given their souls to God not long ago, began to rise, becoming part of the army of the dead. The beast shouted that a nun would be torn apart. The barricade of corpses rushed at the young man. A few seconds later, the boy was being torn apart by wolves that had their fangs in his arms and legs. At this time, the dead soldiers stabbed the boy with their spears, inflicting a piercing wound to his stomach and chest. Seeing that the boy was not a threat, the vulture flew up to an unendil him, the final blow with its clawed handle, to shear your mournful cry. The vulture's head pierced by the bird's pain and abuse of the monster. The boy spat blood from his mouth and laughed. In an instant, everything was filled with a red glow. A pillar of aura rose above the boy. It twisted and divided until the mouths of various mystical creatures began to form to thee. Smiles appeared here and there and then disappeared in the flow of energy, and above them rose the head of a black dragon, which was much larger than the other mouths, and the center of all the chaos was his body. Did not change into the body of a lizard. Instead, he seemed to be covered with an armor of fire and darkness. He had a terrible smile on his face. It was clear that the slaughter and killing, his complete dominance over the enemy, brought him pleasure and happiness. The vulture was frightened. He had never seen such power before. It was too late for the vulture to escape. The dragon's head opened its mouth and charged at him with one bite. The dragon bit off the bird's up her body and swallowed it. Blood flowed like a river from the bird's wounds and mouth, and only the torso and two branches remained. But the life did not leave the vulture. Horror, fear, and despair overwhelmed the vulture as it fell into the dragon's throat and saw hundreds of jaws, claws, and beaks coming at it. The creatures of fire and darkness took him into their arms, tearing the stump of what had once been a mystical beast. The latter's suffering ended only when the monster grabbed the bird's head with its jaws and crushed its head. The blue eyes opened. The first thing the white-haired beauty saw was the darkness and fire clinging to the young man's body, as if seeking refuge in it. She was mesmerized, unable to move or say a word. Lying on the ground, she watched the creepy creatures melt into thin air. A nun who was still shrouded in darkness noticed her, and as she approached the girl, the remnants of the dragon's power almost completely disappeared. The young man said that the girl was free from the control of the demon gun. God, the girl winced in pain. All she could remember was trying to reach for the shining wings. Her words were, "Yet are you also a victim of these wings?" The girl could not understand Anan's words. All she could do was ask, "Who?" The boy wasted the boy's answers, turned her a descendant of the black dragon and a survivor, the devourer of all the demons of the gods of the world, and the one who will destroy the incarnation of the wings. When she heard the main character's words, the girl lowered her gaze, which reading comprehension, confusion, and bewilderment. Sweat was dripping down her face, while her gaze seemed blank. After that, continuing to sit in the ground in front of the protagonist, she confusedly asked the one what he was talking about, adding that she didn't understand what he was saying, not about the black dragon nor about the incarnation of wings. While the girl was talking, the guy, without any emotion on his face, continued to listen to her. Suddenly, the girl's eyes widened, and they were filled with confusion and incomprehension of what was happening. Then, in a confused voice, saying that she was completely lost, she immediately lost consciousness and fell to the ground. As soon as the girl fell to the ground, the lizard sitting on the guy's shoulder his said and looked at him as if asking what had happened to her. A nun continued to look at the girl with his earnest gaze, which almost never changed, and said that she was probably mentally tired of all the information he had given her. Then, looking at the girl, who continued to lose conscious, had thought about what he should do with her. At the same time, the girl was in some space which was painted in blood-red colors. Splashing blood, which was covered with the ground, was running somewhere. Images unknown to her began to appear in her mind, the first of which was a sign that looked like the wings of a dragon. Despair and fear was reflected on the girl's face, who continued to run in Nis into the unknown as if trying to escape from something. Suddenly another image surfaced in the girl's mind, which was the mystical creatures he was turning into. It was covered in darkness and gloom, which instilled fear in the girl's heart. Feeling the gaze on her, the girl continued running and looked back, looking at the one who was chasing her. With despair and fear in her eyes, the mystical creature that followed her was exactly what she had turned into not so long ago. With its massive feet on the blood-stained ground, it continued to follow her as if it was not going to let her go. Suddenly, the girl caught their foot on something and stumbled, not even having the strength to put her hands in front of her. To soften the blow, she fell face down on the ground, splashing the blood that covered the ground. Shivering with terror and fear, the girl struggled to rise. Her face, as well as her clothes, were completely covered in blood, with despair in her eyes. As she looked in front of her, where in the pool of blood was our reflection, but not only her, and terrifying mystical animals' maw eyes, which frighteningly glowed bright blue light. Looking on, the girl realized that all this blood covering the ground was sheer for areas on it belonged to the mountains of corpses that lay on either side of her. The whole thing was reminiscent of hell. The girl looked at their hands, which were completely covered in blood, with horror in her eyes, shaking with fear and despairs. She breathing heavily in panic, tried to understand what was happening to her, but her thoughts were interrupted by a bright white light, which immediately dispersed the darkness that filled the space. This blindingly bright light belonged to a creature whose silhouette resembled an angel with two pairs of wings. The girl immediately turned around to see what had happened. Asa had no idea where the light had come from. However, all she saw was someone's snow-white face with a smile on it. That smile was the last thing the girl saw. For the next moment, she woke up and opened her eyes, uncertainly squinting against the bright daylight shining in her faces. She was surprised to see a girl with pink hair staring at her, who greeted her with a smile on her face when she saw that she was awake. As it turned out, it was not just a girl but a bunny girl, as a pair of cute long ears grew out of her head and a fluffy tail was visible behind her. Raising her hands to the tay, Opshe, glowing with happiness, said that it seemed to her that it was very painful in the dream, and that she had a nightmare. Hearing the bunny girl's words, the white-haired girl wondered if what she had seen was really a dream. However, she was interrupted by a man's voices. He turned around and saw a stern-looking guy, whom she had already seen before she had blacked out. The turned to his lizard and, calling her Ruby, ordered her to start turning to her masters. He nodded in response. In the next moment, her eyes lit up with yellow light, while sparks of flame emerged from her mouth, which was also glowing, after which a huge pillar of flame that was not quite the size of the lizard's body burst out from its mouth. The fire immediately began to consume a large pile of something, flaring up with even greater force. The silhouette of some creature appeared from the flames, its eyes shining with a bright light, as if it was trying to get out. But that was not to be. For the next moment, an even more intense flame consumed not only him but the other corpses as well, and continued to stare at the flaming corpses with his usual scowl on his face. Once the me subsided, the bunny girl, with the same smile on her face, announced that the monster that had been possessed by the demon was finally finished. But note, everyone shared joy and enthusiasm. The main character, with a fierce and cold expression on his face and exuding murderous intent, looked at the bunny girl. She saw his murderous gaze, and with her usual smile, praised him, saying that he hadn't a good job this time. But those words didn't stop, and who the next moment grabbed the girl by the scruff of the neck, causing her to shriek, then lowering himself to Harry Lev. Angrily ordered her to shut up, calling her a garbage information provider, to which she giggled softly. Pointing at the white-haired girls, eating in bewilderment, irritably added that her misinformation was costing him even more this time. Then, giving the girl a bunny slap which made her fall to the floor with a shriek, had told her in an irritated voice that their deal was done, demanding that she pay him immediately. Rising to her feet and smiling, she told him not to get so angry over nothing. Then, turning to the white-haired girl, who was looking at her with wide-open eyes in bewilderment, obviously not understanding what was going on, she asked her if she could know where. Named. The girl answered in a not very friendly voice that her name was. Hearing this, the bunny girl excitedly replied that it was incredible, and that she couldn't believe that there was another victim of the wings just like Ananta. Nadia stared at the girl, wondering what she was talking about. But then the guy's voice interrupted their conversation, and with an annoyed look on his face, he shouted at the bunny girl and told her to stop talking. What is this eternal hurry? Said the bunny girl with a smile on her face. Then she took out a gold mechanical watch on a chain with Arabit symbol engraved on the top of the girl, and her watch looked a bit like the white rabbit from Alice in Wonderland. With a little effort, the bunny opened the lid, which there was a strange mechanism when it was activated. Unexplained magical symbols appeared on the watch in a minute. A huge abyss, both in diameter and depth, formed under the command into which our heroes fell. Nadia couldn't hold back her scream of terror as she fell flying headlong. She tried to somehow catch onto the edge, or at least soften her fall, and none was quite different. Not a single muscle. Eyeing his body or face moved, as if he didn't care about the unexpected trip at all. The crimson lizard clung to the guy's cloak out of habit. The only one who enjoyed the fall was the rabbit girl, seeing that the ground was close. Nadia closed her eyes, expecting a collision with the ground. Nothing happened, and when she opened her eyes, she saw that she was standing on her own 2 feet. Even though she was flying upside down, the surprise of the magical landing replaced and eclipsed the surprise of what she saw. The titanic tree spread its branches in different directions, the ray, emanating from the top of the crown, illuminating the area 4 kilometers around, and in the roots of the 100 was a rich and majestic city. Others stood nearby without showing any emotion. They probably come here. Then the girl thought the bunny turned to the confused girl, caught her with his hand, and said the saying that a clever rabbit digs 3 holes at once, then shedded that she had forgotten to introduce herself and would fix it now. I'm from the largest information network on the continent Rabbit's Foot, and I'm just Anna's informant called Whitefo. The girl said, with her usual smile, pointing to the guys headed that they had been working together for a long time. Looking at the trunk of an ancient tree, the rabbit continued to talk about it. The tree was secret. It was called the White Lotus Tree. The next thing she told us was about the city that surrounded the giant's roots. It turned out to be the largest trading city in the south. The White Paw wanted to add something else, but did not have time. Stop the girl, shout, stop the bunny. Nadia thanked him for rescuing her from the demon control, but she was no longer able to listen to Foot's monologues. So the girl continued, if you want to continue the conversation, answer my question. Why did you bring me to this city? Shut up and follow me. I'll show you everything. With these words, and unsilenced the girl with an expression of complete indifference. He continued on his way, entering one of the streets. The group found themselves at the city market. There were a lot of people, and it was clear from their clothes that they lived in prosperity. The cobblestones that were laid everywhere, and the white stone houses and walls confirmed this. After a while, Nadia broke the silence with a question. She wondered who the man was, the winged incarnation that an unwashanton. G4, the young man replied that he was a disgusting animal who thought there was a god. The girl was not satisfied with the boy's answer and wanted to hear more details. Then the Whitefoot intervened in the conversation, telling her that avatars received their human form and powers from the gods. The winged incarnations can also give power to theirs, but their powers are imperfect, and it is not known whether it is able sing or a curse imperfect. The girl asked again, clearly interested in the bunny's words. Unfortunately, the conversation could not continue. A harsh wickham came from the young man's mouth. The girl looked around and tensed up. She did not notice how an unhandled them into a dark alley with people in chains everywhere. Men, women, and even children were chained and wouldn't shackled their vendors, glancing at the newcomers, sizing them up. Welcome to the calf slave market, said a Whitefoot recently. There have been more people here, the paw continued, not forgetting to show the girl the right way. She continued her story. Immigrants, travelers, vagrants caught by slave hunters, and even animal spirits can all be found here. While listening to the bunny, Nadia looked around the market until her eyes were drawn to a majestic white tiger in a cage. As the group approached the massive door, Nadia looked at the Whitefoot and asked what this place had to do with the incarnation of wings. With one strong kick, Ananta sent their flying. Nadia's body curved and flew forcefully into the open door, after which it rolled down the stairs. For some time, the girl did not immediately realize what had happened. Lying on the cold basement floors, she looked up and saw several people tied up. They looked exhausted and empty. Yade, without understanding anything she said. These people sacrifice, shouted on from the doorways, sacrifices to the incarnation of wings at the top of the sacred tree. Sacrificial offerings are made rising above the green crown of the lotus tree. One could see the green leaves disappear, and instead hundreds of bodies with holes in them hang like garlands on the bare branches. Closing the door, the young man continued the conversation with his usual indifferent expression. You will be bait like these people so that we can catch the incarnation of wings. Nadia froze and a cold sweat broke out on her skin as she saw the young man lock her prison and walk away. A nun was in his usual gloomy mood, and when he left the dungeon had told the bunny girl that the rest was up to her. She didn't mind at all and gladly agreed, but Nadia was not going to give up so easily and set and wait for fate. She made an attempt to learn more about her captors and climbed the steps to the door with the bars. She shouted loudly, "Wait," which attracted the attention of the bunny girl. Nadia clung to the bars in desperation and wondered if all these people imprisoned here were their work. The main character was quiet for a bit at first, but then replied that even if it was, what was she going to do about it? Hegirl shouted in rage at him to stop being outrageous. And answer her questions, she tried to press his feelings of pity and conscience, and said that using weak and innocent people as a way to achieve her goals is, but she had no time to finish her sentence when an Anna looked at there intently and asked if she felt any guilt at all. Then he turned to Goon, and lastly said that it was impossible to get revenge without getting your hands dirty. Nadia was shocked at such a heartless answer and didn't know what to even say to that. Seeing that he was leaving, she tugged the bars and told herself that she couldn't accept it, but the bunny girl remained by the door, and seeing her despairs, she had said that for her it was understandable, these poor people, and even the children among all of them, had already accepted their fate and did not resist. They suspected what awaited them, but they could not even imagine what terrible things they would have to endure at the hands of the incarnation of wings. And when she imagines all that awaits them, tears come to her eyes. However, saying all this, her words did not match her emotions, and it was as if she was laughing at the poor captive and mocking her. This made Nadia wrinkle her face in disgust. She didn't understand how such a cute creature on the outside could be so disgusting on the inside. Nadia answered her not to think that she could just taunt and use her as she pleased, but the bunny girl laughed and replied to her that that was exactly what a nun said, and she would have all the fun she wanted after all. Nadia here, because of what she has done Zavar while under the control of the demon god and has caused a massacre, has killed many people dozens of times more than here in Pry. So now it is very strange that she's worried about a few dozen lives. The girl who heard such accusations was horrified, but the bunny girl continued that even if it wasn't their intention and she wasn't in control, it didn't mean that these things never happened. Nadia's imagination conjured up horrible pictures of the piles of corpses and rivers of blood. She was leaving behind the bunny girls, all were desperation and anger, and smiled. She touched her. Armand advised her not to direct all her anger rather, and for they were not the reason she was. It was all the fault of their common and identical enemy, the evil incarnation of Wings, who was a tapa, huge white lotus tree in the middle of the city. That's who was to be hated the next day. Our hero was sitting in the middle of a passage lined with stone bricks, where there were several warriors beside him, preparing their weapons for battle. Anan was also preparing for battle, and checking his armor. A bunny girl approached him and confidently addressed him, saying that she thought the said something baseless. All those innocent victims had nothing to do with him. I ignored her assertion and asked what happened to that girl. The bunny girl replied that she had asked Nadi for her cooperation, and everything was going according to plan. At the same time, there was a procession of captives in the middle of the city, led by guards more like priests in armor, white cloaks, and with spiky crowns on their heads. Nadia was among the captives, all of whom were about to be sacrificed. They were led to the White Lotus Temple and escorted by the wing guards themselves. Nadia looked up into the clear sky above her head that was displayed in her blue eyes, and didn't know if this was the last time she would see it in her life. She was led along with the rest of the captives to a huge white temple that was located in the roots of a giant tree. This was part of their plan. Or rather, the offering of the victim was the starting point of their plan to meet with the incarnation of Wings. Along with this, they completed all the preparations to hunt down the incarnation of Wings. There was a magical barrier around the White Lotus Temple that was impossible to pass through while it was active. However, during an arena battle that involved as sacrifice, the barrier would be removed for a short time. At that moment, the winner of the arena could ouch the bark and break off a branch from the White Lotus tree, and it was a reward for the winner. After that, the incarnation of Wings would soon descend to him to perform a ritual, at the end of which the winner could receive the power of the beast or die in terrible agony. The bunny girl was optimistic about their plan, which, although sounding simple enough, was very complicated and bloody to execute. If only this guy had made up his mind from the beginning, they wouldn't have had to come up with this plan, because he could have just attracted the attention of his enemy with indiscriminate massacre in the city. Even Souther was still a line that should never be crossed. She looked at a nun who was sharpening his axe with grim determination, and she thought, speaking of monsters, was she trying to draw a line between the dimensions of man and beast. The bunny girl knew a number of means and methods for doing so, but they were all quite controversial, and she knew our hero wouldn't agree to them. And he noticed her look and said that he could hear her rolling her eyes and knew what she was thinking, and still wasn't going to act like the others. Then, picking up his axe, he noted that it hadn't been that long since their last meal, and now was just the perfect time for a post-meal. Workout headed towards the arena exit and told the girl and Ruby the lizard to sit quietly and watch from the sideline. She turned around and added that this was his way, he only hunts beasts. The bunny girl pretended not to understand what he meant, but asked him not to do anything to attract unnecessary attention. And while Ruby yawned, she added that extra attention would complicate things for them and anything could go wrong. Anun replied firmly that he would take that into consideration in the arena. Our hero was about to enter the commander of one of the warriors. Quads shouted to his subordinates to form a wall of shields, which they immediately did, putting up a palisade of spears in front of them. In front of them was a beast that looked like a giant leopard, only with a small head and agent tail around. It lay the corpses of the poor people who had hoped to defeat the beast. Let out a roar, hoping to scare the rest of the warriors and bring confusion to their ranks, but the squad leader shouted to them not to be afraid and to hold the line. However, we will never know whether they would have held their line or not, because one of the warriors put a hand on his shoulder and with force threw him back to the ground. He only had time to cry out in pain, and surprise, it was our hero who entered the arena and removed the annoying obstacle from his path. The other warriors were shocked by the way he boldly stepped towards the monster and asked what the hell is doing. The beast, seeing the fresh and seemingly unintelligent victim, immediately lunged at it with a growl. It brought its large clawed paw up to strike and unsliced through the beast's paw with one powerful blow. That's why its attack never reached its target. Everyone was shocked to see such a powerful blow, and the bunny girl realized that he had isobeat her. After all, she watched the hero's bloody display of strength and remarked to herself, he's such a trouble. The warrior's quad leader didn't understand how this was possible. He had considerable combat experience, but he had never met a warrior with such strength. How could an ordinary man overpower a mystical beast? The wounded beast could no longer move properly, much less attack, but Anun was not going to give the beast a break and prepared for the next attack with. Izzy's burning with rage. After a moment, he had already jumped forward, had pushed off with enough force to fly above the beast and was about to deliver a crushing blow with 2 axes at once. His fierce blow hit the beast's head, knocking it to the ground. All the spectators froze in shock, and it was the first time they had ever seen someone defeat a mythical beast single-handedly and so quickly. Anun pulled out his axe and the dead beast's carcass and looked up and let out a fierce scream like some berserker. He looked up to the top of the tree, asking his enemy to just wait, and he would surely slice him into pieces and eat them alive soon. Meanwhile, despite the protagonist's threats, the top of the lotus tree was glowing with a white radiance, and at its foot the procession with the prisoners went inside behind them. The gates immediately slammed shut with a thud. Nadia didn't like it. She felt as if she had entered a white and well-lit crypt rather than a temple. They were a right little hallway with many pillars to a smaller tree. They were greeted by a loud voice that addressed the fear-filled citizens. Nadia tensed. This man was strangely familiar to her, and mere thought of him instilled fear in her. The man, meanwhile, let goof the small bird. Sat on his finger and with a smile, hessed them to let goof. Their fear he was saying welcome to them and greeting them in the temple of the goddess. He was surrounded by birds and dressed in a white and gold garment and seemed to have wings himself. Wash at the ultimate evil and the incarnation of wings. The temple of the white lotus tree is surrounded by a barrier so strong that the place around it was nicknamed the sacred tree. For some unknown reason, all incarnations of wings settled be in search of offerings. Those who offered as sacrifice to the temple received the rig. To participate in the arena of Zeus warriors who proved their strength in battle against beasts were rewarded with a branch of the white lotus tree, and those who are marked by the incarnation of wings are given a special power. Those who receive this power are called wing guardians. Let's go back to the time when Nadia was just locked in the cell with the rest of the people who were to act as victims. Standing at the cell door, Whitefoot was explaining to the girl their plan, which was to break through the incarnation of wings defenses, and they planned to do so through infiltration under the pretense of sacrifice. Finished, asked with a smile on her face if the girl had any more questions, saying that it would be the last one. Nadia asked why an unwanted to kill the incarnation of wings, and was it something to do with his power? Whitefoot answered after a few seconds of silence that it wasn't that simple, and it would be impossible to explain in 2 words. However, shedded that she could say one thing: a girl with pink hair, long ears, and a hat on her head was standing in the middle of a ruined village that looked like hell, namely, there was a Kriya. Tura called Death Incarnate. At this place was Whitefoot, whose usually cheerful face now lacked the usual smile. There was no emotion on her face, but her gaze was fixed on something, and that by its very nature boggled the imagination. In front of her was the boy who was little and unsitting on his knees in the middle of all this. As hell, he was screaming loudly and violently, holding someone's burnt corpse in his arms. Let us return from our memories to our time at the White Lotus Temple, where the same tall man with white hair and dressed in a stately robe, who greeted the people who had arrived as victims, addressing them in a majestic and present voice, urged them to raise their heads and accept salvation. The tired and more zombie-like people looked at the man with wide-open eyes that read surprise, fear, and shock. Some of them folded their hands and cried out to God at the same time. Closing his eyes, the man in a majestic and present voice introduced himself as the saint whom everyone worships, for he's the owner of the White Lotus Tree, the incarnation of wings, illuminated by a bright light like some deity. He introduced himself as Balzac El Genini Nadia, a strain to listen to the continued speech of this pseudo-deity who addressed the people who had become offerings to him. He was telling them to prepare to enter a world of liberation, where there would be no more suffering and despair. However, it was clear from the faces of the captives that they were not enthusiastic about such a future. Balzac El Geni, with his manic smile, ended his speech with a call to entrust their bodies to the wings of salvation. It was amazing how different his seemingly kind words were from his intentions, but as soon as she fell silent, there was approached with a cry of despair by one of the captives, who tried to show all the respect she was capable of shouting, "O incarnation of wings," the girl fell to her knees and desperately begged him to show mercy and spare her little sister, who was standing beside her. She looked at this monster in a beautiful wrapper and asked him to please spare her sister's life. The incarnation of wings seemed determined to grant her request and extended his hand with the words, "O good people, show devotion with noble hearts." The girl glowed with happiness, not believing ears and eyes. Could it be that her sister would be saved? She looked gratefully at the hand extended to her, but just as she had time to say thank you, her head exploded, littering everything around her. There it was, the true blood-thirsty essence of wings incarnate. Her little sister was shocked and stared at the corpse in horror. Just a moment ago, she thought she was saved, but now everything was lost. Everything she loved. The other captives were horrified. They didn't fully understand what had happened or how the girl could die. Their faces were contorted with fear, horror, and had tread. Nadia was furious, but there was absolutely nothing she could do. Now she just had to wait a little. Andrethine, incarnation of wings, finally stopped playing his role as a noble priest and sat down on his throne made of tree roots, and announced to everyone that in the face of death all are equal, has shifted one foot to the other, and mundanely told the little girl that her sister was free from shame and pity, and soon she would reach nirvana. Balzac sat back on his throne and enjoyed the terror and despair on the faces of his captives. She had expected absolutely no resistance, but something began to happen in the crowd of captives. Nadia froze in place and began to attract the attention of the guards. They began to suspect something and began to draw their swords to deal with the strange prisoner. However, Nadia was not just standing. The redark aura with tongues of dark flame began to emanate from her. She was transforming into her beast for revenge, and in a moment a horrible Wendo head with burning blue eyes appeared in front of the guards, who had no time to do anything. The darkness emanating from the creatures around it and grabbed the guards by the throat, leaving them no chance. The incarnation of the wings looked bored and did not even move from his throne. He noticed that she was not a Xavier. Nadia overheard his snarky remark and angrily answered. Dim that she was a heartless killer. The currents of the dark tribes surrounded her, and she was ready to end it all here. And now Balzac Jenna laughed at there and asked Souther was an incarnation among the victims to him. It was all amusing and nothing more, felt absolutely no danger to himself. Nadia shouted Digdrazel and Karen and began to transform into her monster, tearing the bonds that bound her. Deer adlers from the darkness appeared above her head, and along with her long arms, she was now very much like a wheeled deer. But something caught their attention during the transformation, and she paused a little. She saw the frightened faces of the other captives, who were screaming in terror monster, and didn't immediately realize what had scared them so much. But as soon as she turned around and looked at their frightening shadow, it all became clear to her. The frightening silhouette of her monster was indeed terrifying and frightening. It made her memory flash back to the past, and the mountains of corpses with rivers of blood, all the results of her actions. So even if she didn't want to do such things, it didn't mean they didn't happen. But now she knew how was to blame, and she was determined to get revenge on him. But her thoughts were interrupted by the voice of the wings incarnate, who ordered her not to resist, and, as it turned out, it was hard enough not to obey him. A boy with white hair and a blank stare approached the younger sister of the dead girl and supported her, preventing her from falling. He then turned his gaze to Nadia, who also looked at the children with her black eyes. Suddenly, here ye turned a normal color and a warm smile appeared on her face, giving her a feeling of safety and calmness. In the next instant, hundreds of huge roots burst out of the ground, rushing towards the sky. This ability was named Yggdrasil. Some of the roots immediately grabbed tightly onto the nearby guards, who were bound and had no way to do anything. While the guards were dangling in the air, a large dome-shaped barrier made up of the same Roots appeared around the group of people who were to become victims for the incarnation of wings, which was called Os, standing in front and holding the staff that began to form from the roots. She turned to all the captives and said in a firm voice, not to worry, clenching her hand into a fist, she headed in a determined voice that she would definitely protect them. However, in the next moment her face took an shocked, intense look, because in the next second a large beam of bright light struck the barrier that was in front of her, causing a loud explosion. Balzasalini, who was the perpetrator of this attack, turned to the girl in a mocking voice and called her a cocky deer, and told her to stop talking nonsense. After that he asked in a cocky voice, does a nameless incarnation from a distant land dare to resist them? The silhouette of a girl who held a staff in front of her began to emerge from the dust clouds that appeared after the incarnation attack, and she told the guy that she actually had a name, and my name is Nadia, said the girl in the same unwavering and dignified voice, who had a wreath of the same tree roots formed on her head, and then added in a firm voice that she was an incarnation of nature. The one who heard the girl's words replied in a mocking voice that she was foolish but quite brave. But the girl did not react in any way to the guy's mockery, but concentrated on her upcoming attack once again, beginning to manipulate the roots, which were eventually formed into a huge tree hammer with a bright green light shining around it. This abai. Liddy had the name Suilus while forming the hammer. The girl pondered whether the enemy's previous attack had been an invisible wave or telekinesis a seventh, though she was able to instinctively block it. Its head didn't feel threatened by it, but deciding that it didn't matter. Now she focused on her attack, telling herself that she would crush Balzac. Ilgeni with all her strength in the next second. With all her strength, she attacked the guy with the swoosh hammer, which immediately flew towards him at a great speed. However, despite these seemingly enormous danger, he stood still and only grinned. The next moment, to Nyride sent aura in the shape of various wings formed around him, which resembled the tali of a peacock. The incarnation of wings extended his hand towards Nadia and ordered her to be him. There was a loud and powerful explosion that was heard even in the arena, and a nun stood over the defeated beast and raised his head to see where the noise was coming from. All the people in the stands fidgeted and asked each other what was wrong. Someone in the crowd said that the sound was coming from the white lotus tree, and everyone in media raised their heads to look their event. The warriors in the arena forgot about the battle and stared at the tree. Our protagonist knew roughly what was going on there, but he was as usual speechless mean while inside the white lotus tree. Nadia was shocked by what she saw. She couldn't believe her strongest attack had been destroyed so easily by a single beam of lights. She now realized that her enemy was on a whole other level, for in the face of her attack, hadn't even move, and continued to stare. Either smugly high at the top of the temple hung a huge golden cage, inside of which was darkness from the noise below. It began to shake. The incarnation of wings let the insolent prisoner, who dared to defy him, and asked if such a pitiful power was all she had, and after saying that, he snapped his fingers. The huge golden cage that hung from the ceiling fell to the ground with a loud clang, scattering dust and small stones. Nadia could barely stand on her feet from such a blow. She hadn't realized what was happening, which showed very clearly on her face the next second. However, when the dust cleared, her confusion was replaced by horror as she saw the creature that had broken free from its confinement, a huge shadow of which covered the terrified girl. She hadn't seen anything like it before. This monster had tattered wings with feathers and spikes, and they resembled more the wings of a pterodactyl than a bird. The captive boy shouted to her that it was dangerous, trying to warn her, but it was too late. The very next instant, their eyes widened with pain and surprise. When she looked down at their body, she saw two large bone spikes that had hit her shoulder and the side of her stomach. The incarnation of wings, with his sneaky smile, advised her to be careful. Above him stood his hand monster at full height, the hideousness of which was Char. Tiu described the incarnation of wings, continued his nonsense, and urged her to serve Yo's loyal followers. It would seem that now, with such a monster at this side, none would be able to stop him, and his bloodlust would continue to prosper.